All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going somewhere I bet a lot of you haven't thought too much about before.
Ooh, mysterious. I like it.
It's all about this unexpected link between, well, just learning a language and then actually learning, like, the stuff you need to know in that language. Particularly for folks learning English as a second language, those ESL students.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, you got to know the words before you can learn about volcanoes and photosynthesis and whatever else.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to dig into today. We've got some excerpts from a source called, hang on, ESL Domain I.pdf.
Don't worry, though. We're not going to get all academic and jargony on you.
Definitely not.
The goal here is, like always, those light bulb moments, right? Those, oh, wow, I never thought about it that way kind of takeaways.
Love those.
So right off the bat, this source throws us this list of words. And I got to say, it was a bit of a head scratcher at first. It's like lava, precipitation, species.
Okay, random. I see where you're going with this. Right. Totally out of left field. But then, boom, right next to those, you get evidence, analyze, prediction, infer. So what's the connection? Why these two groups together?
It's like a little puzzle they're setting up for us.
Exactly. And it really got me thinking, you know, when you're learning a new language, does it ever change the way you actually think?
Ooh, that's a good one. And you know what? This might actually get at the heart of a major challenge for, well, anyone learning English as a second language. So those first words you mentioned, the lava, precipitation, those are likely examples of what we call academic vocabulary.
Makes sense. Those are definitely not words you'd use when you're just chatting with a friend or ordering a coffee.
Right. They're specialized. Those are words that pop up across different school subjects. But it's the second group, those analyze, predict words. That's where it gets really interesting.
Why is that?
Well, those point to this idea that language is way more than just basic communication, right? It's how we think critically, how we solve problems. And that's where these terms BICS and CALP come in. They're right there in our source material.
Okay, I got to admit, whenever I hear acronyms, my brain kind of zones out. So before we lose anyone, can you break those down for our listeners? I think everyone's had that experience where you just couldn't get something until you understood the specific words being used.
Oh, for sure. The right words can unlock a whole new level of understanding. So BICS, that's basic interpersonal communication skills. Think everyday language, the stuff you use when you're chatting with your neighbor or ordering a pizza, social situations.
Right, the basics.
Exactly. But then you've got CALP, and that stands for Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. This is the language of like textbooks, classroom discussions, research papers. It's how you grapple with those big, complex ideas.
So that's what makes it harder. It's more specialized.
And that's the challenge for a lot of ESL students. They might be totally fluent in BICS, sound like native speakers in casual conversation, but then they hit this wall in academic settings because their CALP isn't quite there yet.
Wow, that's such a big distinction. I hadn't really thought about it that way before. So how can teachers help bridge that gap? What can they do to support those English language learners?
Well, our source points to some really interesting research suggesting you can actually build CALP from a student's BICS knowledge. It's all about making those connections between everyday language and the more academic stuff. And one of the most effective ways to do that is through visuals.
Visuals like pictures and diagrams.
Yeah, but not just any old visuals. Think graphic organizers, flow charts, those infographics that break down complicated relationships, things that take those abstract ideas and make them more concrete and accessible. And of course, tying things back to real-world examples, things that connect to students' existing knowledge and experiences.
You mentioned effective teaching earlier, and I noticed this phrase in the source that I got to admit kind of made me do a double take. It's called linguistically accommodated content instruction.
I see why you did a double take. It is a bit of a mouthful.
It is. So what in the world does that even mean? And is this something that only applies to ESL classrooms?
It sounds really complicated, but at its core, it's about making sure the content itself, whatever you're trying to teach, is accessible to all students no matter their level of English proficiency. And the source actually gives some really practical examples.
Like what?
So one is embedded resources. Think vocabulary definitions right there in the text, or maybe a little glossary at the end. Another is, visuals, but not just as decoration. They should actively illustrate the content, those tricky processes.
So if you're teaching about something like photosynthesis.
Exactly. Instead of just describing it with words, you could have a diagram showing how sunlight, water, and CO2 interact, with all those key terms clearly labeled. It makes it way easier to understand, especially if you're still learning the language.
It's amazing how much we take for granted when we're already fluent, right?
Yeah.
We don't always realize how much language impacts our ability to understand something new.
Totally. And if we zoom out even further, I think this idea applies to good teaching in general, regardless of the subject. It's about making those complex ideas understandable and engaging for everyone. So even things like instructional modeling, where the teacher actually shows students how to approach a problem, that benefits all learners.
So this is not just about simplifying things, it's about providing the right support.
Exactly. And that's why linguistically accommodated instruction isn't just for ESL students, it's just good teaching practice, period.
Makes sense. Now, I want to touch on something else the source brings up, the whole language-culture relationship. How does our cultural background influence the way we learn and use language?
Ooh, such a great question. And honestly, this is such a rich area to explore because culture shapes so much of how we communicate, even beyond just the words themselves.
Yeah, it's like there's all this unspoken stuff that goes on.
Exactly. Culture influences our nonverbal cues, what we find funny, how direct we are in conversations. And you can imagine how that could lead to misunderstandings, especially when you're learning a new language.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's say you have a student who comes from a culture where it's considered rude to openly disagree with someone, especially an authority figure like a teacher.
Oh, I can see where this is going.
Right. That student might struggle in a classroom debate, not because they don't understand the material, but because they're trying to navigate these different cultural norms around how to express their opinion. And that can be really tricky.
It's not just about knowing the vocabulary, it's about understanding the whole context of how language is used.
Precisely. And that just highlights how important it is for educators to be sensitive to these differences. It's about seeing students' diverse cultural backgrounds not as obstacles, but as strengths that can be incorporated into the learning process.
It makes the classroom a much richer environment for everyone.
For sure. It helps us all learn from each other and broaden our perspectives.
Okay, so as we start to wrap things up here, what are the big aha moments, the key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with?
All right, so first and foremost, remember that language is about way more than just talking. It's the foundation of how we think, how we learn, how we make sense of the world. And that's why developing that academic language, that CALP, is absolutely crucial for success in school, especially for those learning English as a second language.
Couldn't agree more.
And second, don't underestimate the powerful connection between language and culture. It impacts how we learn, how we understand things, how we interact with each other. It's something we should always be mindful of.
And to leave everyone with one final thought, something to ponder. Think back to a time when you struggled to understand something because of the language being used. How could that experience have been different if you'd had more support, more guidance? Whether you're a teacher, a student, or just someone who's fascinated by language, I think these insights have implications for all of us.
Absolutely. It's something worth reflecting on.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. And until next time, keep those light bulbs burning bright.
See you next time.